Hello everybody. One thing that I've always been very proud of here on the channel is the fact that I will still do, quite happily I should say, reviews of ordinary cars. The exceptionally unexceptional. Because let's be honest here, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Maseratis, Porsches, all that kind of stuff, they're lovely and they're great and they're wonderful, but you don't really generally start with a car like that, nor is something like that usually your daily driver either. And if you are honest with yourself, most people that have a supercar, it tends to be their least used vehicle. The car which we oddly tend not to care about so much, yet we really should, is the one that does the daily duties. And that's exactly the kind of car I'm reviewing today. This is a BMW X3 M Sport. Not an M, just an M Sport. And on paper, I should hate it because it's an X3. It's not even the sort of full X5. It's not a big SUV. It has a piddly little 2-litre diesel engine in it. It has the M Sport suspension, which in BMW land is usually code for just a really unpleasant ride. And yet there are an awful lot of things that would make this an extremely compelling purchase. Now, at first glance, I actually didn't even realise that this was the X3 I was due to review today, because had you asked me, I would have said this was an X5. The reason I say that is because this is actually fractionally larger than the original X5. Yep, these cars have grown by quite a bit. I still think of the X3 really as a relatively dainty off-roader, which in fact probably these days is the X2. As it happens, the X2 is just about one of my least favourite cars of all time, because it doesn't really have a very difficult job to do, the X2. It should just get you from A to B in relative comfort and in a nice interior, being a BMW, and that's it really. But the X2 that I drove a few years ago was horrible, cheap and nasty inside, rode really badly, had no power, wasn't particularly brilliant on fuel. It was just a disaster. This, I'm happy to say, has got off to a much better start. First off, perhaps as a result of its increasing size, this is a usefully large car. I originally thought that this would perhaps be a good comparison with the Nissan Qashqai that I drove a little while ago, but in truth this sits well above it in terms of class. The interior is also a world apart from the Nissan. Everything feels somewhat cohesive, everything feels like it's from roughly the same era. There's a few sort of typical BMW trademarks, like the overly chunky steering wheel, which in a sporty car would annoy me, but in here it just kind of works. Funny being the other side of the equation, looking down on some poor chap in an MX-5. There's plenty of leather in here and some nice lighting, there's a little bit of trim here, but in typical BMW fashion, the specification is a complete mixed bag. So you do have all this mood lighting, you've got heated seats, you've got these little bits of metal with X stamped on them all over the place. You even have, get this, double glazing in an X3. But you don't have a proper stereo with nice tweeters up here, or electric seats. I can't imagine who spec'd a car with double glazing but not lecky seats. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. The boot is a really good size. There's even room under the floor as well for odds and sods, including the little parcel shelf, so that can be tucked away neatly. And that's a really nice thing, because so often I've taken the parcel shelf out of a car and you then realise it has nowhere to go, so it just slides around in the back. BMW have thought of that. You've got parking sensors, front and rear, and a reversing camera at the back. You even have cameras up here too, because whoever spec'd this car from new spent about £700 on the official BMW action cam thing, which is mad. Apparently it will even start recording if you just walk up to the car, so it'll film you if you're trying to damage it or whatever. All very trick. The little iDrive system up here is pretty much standard issue BMW, and this bit works quite well. You've also got in here, and this is the first time I've encountered it, BMW's little digital display. It's still not as good as the gold standard, which is the Audi virtual cockpit. I'm not actually even sure it's perhaps as good as the Jaguar one, because the Jag one, although it's a bit rough around the edges versus Audis, you can actually program it and do stuff with it. Whereas this, you can alter things from the menu in here and so on and so forth, but it just never really seems to do much than what it does. The car has also been specified with adaptive dampers, and this, I'm told, does make a big difference. And you might all be thinking, James, why are you drawing comparisons with a Nissan Qashqai? This is a car that is a lot more money, and it should be a lot more money, because the list price of this 2-litre diesel xDrive X3 M Sport was 47 grand. However, this one was picked up by its owner Russell for, are you ready, 31 grand with just 200 miles on the clock. As a cancelled order, the guy bought it, realised he couldn't afford it, bailed, and it was picked up for, £16,000 off list. So this car costs the same as the list price on the Qashqai that I drove. Let's see if it's quick. It's not, but it's brisk enough. The 8-speed ZF gearbox also works really well, shifts nice and smoothly, and the car actually does ride all right. This was one of the highlights in the Nissan. It rode very softly. It's a problem I had with the Kia Sportage and a few other cars I've driven in the recent past too. Notably, say, the Jaguar XF Sport Brake, which is the sort of car I wanted to love, but it just had too many flaws. And this is doing all right. So you have, of course, different driving modes. You've got Eco Pro, and if you are interested in economy, this will do 45 miles to the gallon. Russell offered me this car after he saw my review of the Renault Zoe. It's actually not his first time having a car on the channel, because I also reviewed his mini John Cooper Works Roadster thing, R59 I think it's called. Anyway, and he said, look, this is the sort of boring ordinary car that I've got, but what I paid for it is the same price as a fully spec Zoe, and it's certainly a lot more car, because it'll do 45 to the gallon, which means with this fuel tank, the real world range is over 600 miles. That's incredible. I mean, averaging at the minute 43.3. That's between me driving it for a bit, him driving it for a bit. That's very good. A lot of modern cars don't really get that anymore. The suspension is kind of doing its job, and I've got to say, the steering's actually kind of good too. This isn't really the sort of car where I'd normally be reviewing it for its sporty credentials, but as we're here, oh, and of course, BMW get the gear shift the right way round. So, as unnatural as it might be, let's see what this big 2-litre diesel barge is like to hoon. Hot hatch it is not, but it's actually quite a laugh. Now, there really is no point whatsoever in trying to row your own gears. The best thing to do is just leave it in sport mode. I mean, it's a diesel engine, it's got fairly even torque, about 295 pound-foot, it's about 400 odd newton meters through pretty much all the rev range. So it's brisk, it's not fast, but it does the job. And it does really just feel like there's a slightly bigger, not hot, but warm hatch. Turning response is great, but you can overload the tyres very quickly. You feel the front end starting to just scrabble for grip. It's currently got Pirellis on it, and they're doing okay. Mercifully, doesn't have run flats on it at all. There are a few things that I don't like about the car. The dash up here is sort of nasty, cheap, scratchy stuff, which is a shame considering there's actually some quite nice leather and contrast stitching and things in here. Note you even have the little BMW tricolour on the seat belts. You've also got it on the front grille. That's something that Russell put on, and he knows the flack he's going to be getting for that. So yeah, let him have it with both barrels, you lovely people in the comments section. I would take that off. That's a Essex car park thing to do to your BMW. In my tricky hill start turnaround test, the car does really well. Visibility is actually not that bad either. You can place it pretty easily. You have 4-zone climate control in here. In fact, one of the few options I really wish this car had that it doesn't is a sunroof. That to me really would just lift the whole thing. Come on, you got to put your foot quite far down, even in sport mode, to get it to kick down, and there's not a huge amount that happens when it does, but that's fine. You can maintain reasonable pace with this car, and it's a better driver than I thought it would be. yeah, steering response is decent. Brakes work well too. In fact, the pedals got just the right amount of feel for me. The pedals themselves are actually quite nice to look at too. BMW are a company that I'm sort of constantly struggling to kind of stay in love with. Historically, they were always really my sort of favourite car brand. I own more BMWs than any other kind of car. But there's a lot of stuff they've made that I just didn't really like at all. And the 230i that I drove recently, just such a disappointing car, and it shouldn't have been, because the old 330 and stuff like that was a real gem. This should be pants, but it's actually not. I'd have it with a Meteor engine, and I'd love to see what the X3 M is like, because I think that could be quite wild. That could be a laugh, that car. It's difficult when you drive things like this, because so much of the normal stuff I kind of talk about, you know, brakes, steering feel, all that jazz, ultimately it isn't really that relevant, is it? I mean, does it matter to people buying these kind of cars? I don't know. The fact that it actually is decent and enjoyable and fun is the icing on a cake. But if it didn't get the basics right, then it would fail. I think even at 47,000 quid, this doesn't feel like bad value for money. But at 30 odd grand, it's a steal, an absolute steal. This is the xDrive 2, so if you do want to do some mild off-roading, it will be capable of that, albeit I'm sure not world-beating. If you like, you can get it with a petrol engine. There's a bigger diesel, which I think might be the pick of the range. The BMW straight six diesels, often pretty cool things. There's a hybrid, there's also a new electric one, but that's a lot of money, like all electric cars. And generally speaking, if I was going to have, you know, a boring car to do the day-to-day stuff for a couple of years, you could do a lot worse than this. The seats look decent, and they are actually pretty comfortable. No lumbar adjustment though. The fact they don't have electric in them is still bothering me. That really is bugging me, because I look at little stuff like the little stitching on the airbag on the steering wheel. That's lovely. It's a little detail you don't tend to find in Audis until you get to, say, like the RS products, that kind of thing. But the paddles to change gear with, they're alright. They're a bit plasticky. They try to look metal. In fact, I think they might be plastic on the back, metal on the front, so the bit that you touch doesn't feel as nice as the bit you look at. Hey ho. In all fairness, you can't really use these to change gear with, because if you're actually pressing on, you can't really hear the engine at all anyway, so you've no idea when you do need to change up. Ultimately, here's the big thing about this car. Most BMWs really aren't M3s, M5s, all that sort of stuff. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that. They just assume that every BMW is going to be this razor sharp, you know, hard-edged sports car. And that's just not the case at all. What a BMW should be, the way they built their reputation, is by essentially being just your ordinary car equivalent. Just a little better, just a little nicer inside, just a little better performing, just a step above a Ford, a Vauxhall, that kind of thing. And this is exactly that. It's not an exceptional car, but it is an ordinary car done exceptionally well. So there we have it. This car is yet another surprise on the channel. I'm happy to say another positive one. Didn't really think this would be much of anything, but very happy to be wrong on this occasion. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thanks for tuning in. Big thank you to Russell for bringing his car out once again. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.